What really shapes how we see historical figures? Especially those from way back, the ones central to huge belief systems. How do we even ask if they truly existed when the main stories are, well, so tied up in faith?
It's a really profound question, isn't it? It makes us think hard about what counts as evidence, how stories about the past get built, and how they stick around. When someone becomes that foundational, history and legend often get tangled.
Exactly. Which brings us to what we're diving into today, a really fascinating and complex question.
Hmm.
What do the sources we have actually suggest about the historical existence of the Prophet Muhammad?
Hmm.
And right off the bat, it's super important for you listening to know. We are looking at this purely through a historical lens, using only the academic materials provided. This isn't about faith, not about theology.
Absolutely. Our goal here is to explore the arguments, the insights in these analyses, historical, linguistic, and understand the difficulties in trying to assess the historicity of someone from that far back. We're looking at the threads of evidence available within these specific sources.
And those sources, yeah, they're varied. We've got scholarly looks at religious texts, historical accounts, even deep dives into linguistics. Each gives a different perspective, but also, has its limits when you're trying to piece together a life from the 7th century.
And those limits are key, really key. We don't have the kind of contemporary day-by-day records you might find for later figures, the big biographies, the collections of sayings, the hadith. They mostly come later.
Right, sometime after his traditional lifetime.
Exactly. And that time gap means we have to consider how those stories might have been shaped, perhaps unconsciously, by the needs and the evolving understanding of the early Islamic community itself.
Okay, so let's start there with those early Islamic sources. Historians often point out, as you said, that the main biographies and hadith came later. Christoph Luxemburg's work, which focuses heavily on linguistics, also talks about the consolidation of the Quran under Caliph Uthman. What does that potentially mean for understanding the historical Muhammad?
Well, Luxemburg suggests this push for one unified Quranic text, which was about dogmatic unity. Creating a standard could have influenced how earlier accounts were transmitted or even interpreted. When a movement is solidifying its scripture, there's a kind of natural pressure towards standardization.
Which might iron out older variations or ambiguities.
Potentially, yes. Things that might have offered slightly different historical clues could get smoothed over in that process.
And then there's the whole oral tradition aspect. These stories, these teachings, they were spoken and remembered long before they were comprehensively written down. Luxemburg points to someone like Tabari, a major historian, seemingly not too bothered by the lack of diacritical points in early Quranic writing. The dots that tell letters apart in Arabic. Why is that significant?
Because without those marks, the same basic letter shapes, the consonants, could be read in different ways. Tabari's view might reflect that, in his time, a strong oral tradition still existed to clarify the correct reading. But for historians looking back,
It highlights flexibility.
it highlights the potential fluidity of the text in its earliest stages. It underscores that there might have been variations in understanding before things became fixed.
Luxemburg also brings up this interesting detail from tradition about the embarrassment on the part of the prophet concerning the 7 readings of the Quran. What could that hint at, historically speaking?
Well, the tradition itself explains this as relating to different dialects, but from a historical, maybe even a psychological perspective, you could see it as potentially pointing to a period of genuine textual uncertainty, or maybe the existence of actual variations before a single definitive version was established. It suggests the development might have been more organic, less immediately uniform.
Okay, this leads us into probably the most potentially radical part of the analysis we have here. Luxemburg's Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran. This is a very different way of looking at the core text. What's the basic idea?
The core idea is that the Quran might contain a significant linguistic layer that isn't purely Arabic, but stems from Syro-Aramaic, a related Semitic language prevalent in the region. Luxemburg argues some parts might have originated in that language, and later Arabic readings might have occasionally misunderstood the original meaning.
So for you listening, the key takeaway is that the language itself might be more mixed, more complex than the traditional view suggests.
Exactly. It suggests a more interwoven linguistic landscape in 7th century Near East.
He gives some really striking examples, like the idea of pure spouses in paradise. Luxemburg connects this not to companions, but possibly to an Aramaic root meaning white grapes. That paints a very different picture.
It does. It shifts from, eternally pure companions to perhaps a more literal, maybe even symbolic description of paradise involving something tangible like grapes. It shows how getting back to a potential earlier linguistic layer could radically change the interpretation of key concepts.
And he looks at specific words, too, like zanim, which translators have struggled with. What's his angle there?
He points out how inconsistent the traditional Arabic commentaries are on Zanim. He proposes it might actually have Hebrew or Aramaic roots, suggesting the Arabic form we see could be a later misreading or adaptation of a non-Arabic word. It's detective work, trying to trace words back.
It's not just obscure words either, right? He examines words like null, usually wasp, and sees Syro-Aramaic links.
Yes, he argues Nal is likely borrowed from Syro-Aramaic. And it's not just about finding loanwords, it points to this deeper linguistic mixing bowl at the time. Same with his analysis of Anya, often cry, but used for lightning too. He connects it to a Syro-Aramaic root, suggesting the metaphor might have been there from an earlier linguistic stage.
He even gets into grammar, like the later addition of the letter alif potentially changing meanings and suggesting Torah, might relate to an Aramaic word for teaching or law, yoria. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Sure. The Aleph point shows how tiny script changes over time could potentially alter meaning. And linking Tara to Aramaic Uria again suggests that even terms we strongly associate with specific traditions might have had related but distinct roots in the broader Syro-Aramaic linguistic world of that era.
And this goes for everyday phrases too. Greetings, ways of saying after.
Luxemburg proposes Syro-Aramaic origins for phrases related to greeting, Quartaslama, and time, mentuf, after. He even rereads musakara, usually made subservient, suggesting Syro-Aramaic roots hinting at holding back or lingering. It implies this influence could be woven deep into the language.
Okay, so taking all this linguistic work by Luxemburg together, it paints a picture of the Quran's language being potentially much more connected to the wider Syro-Aramaic world than just the Arabian Peninsula. What does that mean for, maybe indirectly, thinking about the historical Muhammad?
Well, Luxemburg's main focus is the text. But if you accept his linguistic arguments, it makes you rethink the whole cultural and linguistic environment where Islam began. It suggests maybe a more diverse, less purely Arabian setting. That could influence how we understand the development of early Islamic ideas, though it doesn't directly prove or disprove Muhammad's existence.
It adds complexity to the context.
Definitely.
Now, let's shift gears slightly. Historians always look for outside corroboration, right? Contemporary accounts from people not part of the tradition itself. When it comes to Muhammad, there seems to be a relative lack of detailed contemporary non-Muslim accounts describing his life while he was supposedly alive. How much weight does that carry?
In historical research, that kind of absence is always noted. Doesn't mean something didn't happen. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as they say. But it does mean that the detailed stories we do have about Muhammad's life come primarily from within the later Islamic tradition itself.
So the primary narrative source is internal to the developing faith.
Largely, yes, for the detailed biography. And this naturally leads historians to ask how those narratives might have developed and been shaped over time by the believing community.
This brings in a sort of psychological angle, too. We know humans create foundational myths, origin stories. They're powerful for group identity, for cohesion. How might that play into the Muhammad narrative?
Well, having a clear central founding figure like Muhammad is incredibly powerful for any emerging religious movement. Shared stories, a common origin point, these things build unity, create a collective identity. Psychologically, these narratives can become deeply embedded, part of the group's understanding of itself, and sometimes resistant to critical historical probing.
And the fixing of a canonical text,
Mhm.
like the Quran, as Luxemburg discussed in terms of standardization, that would likely solidify those narratives even further, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Once you have the book and the story established, they become the main lens through which the past is viewed within that tradition. It shapes collective memory.
So if we pull these threads together, the later dating of key Islamic sources, Luxemburg's linguistic ideas pointing to maybe a different textual origin, the lack of detailed contemporary non-Islamic accounts, what are the main cautions for you, the listener, trying to understand Muhammad's historicity from this material?
I think the biggest caution is not to jump to definitive conclusions based only on this. Luxemburg's linguistic work, for example, is fascinating, but it is debated among scholars. These sources we're discussing focus mainly on the text and later history. They don't, in themselves, prove or disprove Muhammad's existence.
Right.
What they do highlight very powerfully are the challenges, the complexities, how difficult it is to reconstruct the life of anyone from that period, especially someone at the heart of a major religion, using the kinds of evidence that survive.
So our goal here wasn't really to give a yes or no answer, which this material doesn't seem equipped to do anyway. It was more about exploring the questions, the puzzles that come up when you apply historical and linguistic tools to these foundational stories.
Exactly that. We've seen how linguistic analysis can offer really surprising, maybe unsettling, new ways to look at text you thought you knew. And we've touched on how the very nature of historical evidence, especially from so long ago, makes this whole endeavor incredibly complex.
It leaves you, the listener, with some big things to think about, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, how do we navigate that space between critical historical inquiry and deeply held faith when looking at the origins of traditions? What does it actually mean if foundational stories are subject to ongoing scholarly debate and reinterpretation? Does that challenge faith? Does it enrich our understanding of history? It's a profound question that goes beyond just this one figure.